Dana Gillespie, you are a legend. I know I've been hearing about you for so many years, so it's such a privilege to meet you, to actually meet you and talk to you and find out more about you. And I've just been listening to your fabulous new single, and I love the lyrics. Did you write that yourself?
No, you're talking about Spent the Day in Bed.
Yeah.
No, it's a song written by Morrissey. I must say, I don't really know very much about Morrissey because I haven't never heard even the Smiths. But since we recorded this, and it's from my album, which is produced by Mark Armand and Tris Penner, and Tris is a friend of Morrissey's, and he suggested, why not do this on the album? And I so love the lyrics too. Stop watching the news because the news contrives to frighten you. Well, every time you switch on the news, it gets worse and worse. And can it get any worse? Yes, of course it can. You know, the new single, I've always been an albums artist. I mean, for many, many years. Singles, obviously, I made in the 60s. And then singles kind of disappeared. I think my last single was maybe in the 70s or 80s, and then a great gap of just albums. And in fact, this album is my 74th album, which people usually go,
wow.
But not everyone knows about some of them. Because 10 of them are in Sanskrit, because I'm mad about all things Indian and have been since the 60s. And quite a lot of them I'm counting show albums, like when I was the first Mary Magdalene in Jesus Christ Superstar, so I count that as well. So if one counts up the tally, this is the latest one, this is the 74th. I could say there's one for every year I've been alive, but I just had my 75th birthday. So I'm going to have to make another album this year to kind of get the scores right.
Absolutely. And I think it's fantastic that you were first Mary Magdalene, but also you did a lot with some really legendary people as well, didn't you? With like Bowie.
Well, yes. Well, Bowie, of course, I first met when I was 14 at the Marquee Club. That was 1965. We always remained friends because in 1970 he said to me, "We really need a decent manager," and he and his then wife Angie found this incredible guy called Tony DeFries, who started a company called Main Man, and they had me, Bowie, Mick Ronson, who was Bowie's guitarist, and Iggy Pop in the company. And for about 4.5 years, everything went swimmingly well, in fact, gloriously well. I had 24/7 limos, I had an assistant, we were in America a lot because I was signed to RCA in America. And then, you know, I always knew the house of cards had to crumble, and thus it did. Sadly, with Bowie and the manager Tony DeFries being in litigation for ages, he had lawyers everywhere around him, but I was caught up in the same madness of contracts because I had the same contract actually as Bowie had. We signed away in 1970, as you do. If somebody comes along and says, "Let me give you all the musicians you want, all the studios you want, whatever you want, it's yours," we both said, "Yeah." But I came back from America because I'm very European and I like being in Europe. I do go to America. I was in America last year at the South by Southwest Festival, where I think I probably was the oldest person performing there until I discovered the Zombies were on as well. They're my age. Yippee.
Are they still alive?
Oh, very much. They have a lot of hits. I mean, they had a lot of hits in the old days and they're still going strong. So yeah, I've had an interesting life. But that's the cleaner version. You know, in the 60s and 70s, you could have actually a lot of fun without anyone judging you or being awful. And of course, those days were much safer than they are now. We didn't have stabbings in those days. We didn't have people complaining and whinging all the time. If something wasn't right, you just got on with it. Times are very much.
It's weird, isn't it, that things have changed so much one way, like, you know, especially with women and the Me Too thing, that, you know, nowadays, you know, you can't say anything to a man or to a woman without them being offended. However, on your phone, you can watch porn, which you couldn't find in those days. You know, it was really hidden. And so it's bizarre, isn't it?
It is bizarre, but I noticed this. Well, I brought out my memoirs, which are called Weren't Born a Man, and I talk about this in my memoirs because when I was younger, from the age of 11 going to school, you know, I've always lived in central London. You had to dodge flashers in the morning. They were a thing. I mean, maybe people still do flash, but well, certainly not at my age, and they're not going to flash. But there I was in my school uniform doing a paper round to save up for a drum kit from the age of 11 to 15. And I'm all in favor of child labor, actually, by the way, controversially, because that first bit of money you make when you're a kid is fabulous. And I worked part-time in a record store in the evenings after school, making, you know, the paper round was 12 and 6 a week in the old money. However, you had to not just dodge flashers, but you had, you know, tossers that would kind of grope you on the tube going to school. But one thing I sort of missed when I was younger, you'd walk past a scaffolding with a load of workmen up there, and you know, they might give you a wolf whistle, or they'd shout down something really silly like, "Have you got a cold?" Or "You look a bit chesty to me." All what I call gay banter and harmless. But now if somebody's going to do that, they're going to get arrested. So I actually think bring back the old days, which are never going to happen, when you could actually have fun, and because it was safe. Nowadays there's so much dreadful stuff on the internet that I think it's sowed seeds of awfulness in lots of people.
I think, you know, there's a lot to be said for people not harassing people in jobs, women in jobs, you know, because I remember a friend of mine saying that when she started out doing an office job, that her father said to her, "Don't go into the copy room on your own," because it was a given that everyone would rope everyone. And I think that's probably good that stopped. It's just,
probably.
I just think it's gone too far from the point of view of, as you said, historical stuff, because people are just coming out of the woodwork now who wants to make a buck or two, you know?
I think it's scandalous that they all want to make money. I just
think it's and I think that, so the true people who've really had a rough time, you know, then they get a bad time because of the people that didn't. And I think that's where it's gone wrong. I think
there's a balance though, because Harvey Weinstein, he had to be called out.
Yeah.
You know,
those were those days. I'm not standing up for him, but lots of things went on in the 60s and 70s.
But he was more recent, wasn't he? I mean, it was only his was, you know, quite recently. I mean, from when the last, you know, rape happened, quite recently. I think it was 2012 or 14. So he was at it.
You've been following the case? I couldn't care less. I'd switch off and look at anything else. I couldn't care less what goes on in America.
No, I just think wasn't just America, it was here. And I grew up in the business as well. And I remember my mother introducing me to Jimmy Savile at Top of the Pops in probably the late 60s. And she said, "Debbie, this is Jimmy. Jimmy, this is Debbie." And she said, "If you touch her, I will kill you," in front of me. And she said to me, "He's a dirty old man." Now, everybody knew, it was common knowledge, but I don't think people knew he was. If my mother would have known that he raped people, I think her attitude would have been different. I saw a dirty old man as something different. Do you not agree?
Yeah, well, he was creepy, let's face it, and he had appalling dress sense. And as for his hairdo, he should be shot. And I never even liked what he said on television as a DJ. I would switch. Well, I wouldn't switch off because I think there was only 2 channels in the early days, or 3. But he never floated my boat. That's for sure. Well, you were lucky to escape his.
Well, only because of what my mother told me.
Well, when you say I might have known your parents, what were they doing in the business?
No, my stepfather was Morris King and my mother was Mary Arnold.
Okay, remember the name of Morris King? Was he?
Yeah, capable management.
Right, right. Yes,
they used to look after the Walker Brothers, the Rocking Berries, kind of all of that sort of group of people, Tony Hatch and Jackie Trent. So they knew David. They actually produced.
Well, you're going back to the 60s, because I remember meeting the Walker Brothers when they literally just got off an aeroplane, or it could have been a boat. This was early 60s.
Yeah, that's who they represented.
Oh, and he's in town. She's in town. I mean, that was the name of their single.
That's Rocking Berries. Yeah. and then also Tony Hatch, and Tony Hatch actually produced David, so that's how I knew David as well. So it's
Right.
it's all connected. And I did meet you when I was very young.
Where did we meet?
Oh, somewhat, God knows, Dana, you know, somewhere, the Marquee, somewhere I
Right.
shouldn't have been.
But they were great days, the Marquee, because I was going there from the age of 13, and I was lucky to have parents that were very liberal, because I actually lived at home, although in a separate flat in their big house in South Kensington. And so I could tell them everything. And, you know, they obviously didn't know what a blues club was, but it was all kind of innocent. You all went there because you loved music. Nobody in those days ever thought they were going into the music business to make huge amounts of money. You know, I remember Mick Jagger once saying in an early interview that he thought after 3 years he'd probably be out looking for a normal job. Nobody thought they were going to be cashing in. People that cashed in were, let's say, Elvis, and it was so far away, it was over in America. Most people in the early 60s didn't even have a passport. It was a whole different world. I know that lots of amazing bands went on there. Lots of people were spawned, if that's the right word, you know, like the Stones and the Yardbirds, which of course means Eric Clapton, or Jimmy Page and John Paul Jones, that then went on to be Led Zeppelin. But these guys were also, Jimmy Page and John Paul Jones were all the top session guys. So anyone that made records in the 60s, as I did, you had Jimmy Page on guitar. Fabulous.
Wow.
He was great.
Tell us, Dana, about your lovely music festival in Mystique. Because I've always wanted to come.
I don't run it anymore. I started it. And so this next January, it's going to be 30 years old. But I ran it for the first 20 years. So I started it because I happened to go there a lot. I was at school with the then owner of the island, Lord Glenconner. His sister was at the same school as mine, so I knew about the island. And I first went there in 1970 when you could swim naked on a beach because nobody was there. There were no cars. There was no. The Mystique doesn't have natural water, so if it didn't rain for a few days, you had to really conserve your water, and it didn't grow much either. So it was very primitive, which was fabulous. You could walk anywhere. And now, of course, it's all manicured lawns and everyone drives air-conditioned cars. What on earth do you need that for in the Caribbean? I can't think. However, it was 31 years ago, the guy that ran Basil's Bar, his name was Basil, of course, he loved the blues. I always did the blues. And we sat one night late at night saying, why don't we start a blues festival? And I said, if you buy a piano for your bar, I will find musicians. And the whole thing was to raise money for Basil's charity, which is to help education for children on the next door island of St. Vincent, which was very poor. And that's how it started. He went straight off to New York, bought a white piano because he wasn't racist. And so I started to bring the musicians in, and it ran for 15 days every year. And my job was to find the musicians, persuade them to come to the West Indies in 5-star luxury for 15 days without
Must have been hard.
I just dangled a little thing and they said, yes, take me. And the first few years were very small in the audience, and it got bigger and bigger. And after 20 years, Basil really wanted to run it with more American artists, and I was bringing mostly British artists because I know them better. And also I was producing an album of the festival every year. So 20 of my 74 albums is the Mystique Festival. And we would sell the CDs to make money to raise it for his charity, for which he got an OBE for doing this. When the festival first started, and I was always there with my band, the London Blues Band, but they were the house band, and I could see Princess Margaret in the audience. And I specialize in rather naughty, risque lyrics of blues, especially as I'd gone in 1980 to a record label and I said, I want to do an album and I want to call it Blue Job with all the blues I can find. They laughed. Anyway, one of the songs off this album is called King Size Papa, originally done by somebody called Julia Lee and her boyfriends in the 40s. So I sang this song, and it's not a well-known song, but it's got none of the lyrics from those days were ever crude. They were just tongue-in-cheek, funny stuff, you know. So I could see that Princess Margaret was mouthing the lyrics to this song, and I'm thinking, how on earth does she know this song? And after the music was over, she came around the backstage area and she said, "Gosh, I love that King Size Papa by Julia Lee and her boyfriends." And I said, "Heavens, ma'am," rhymes with spam, "Heavens, ma'am, how do you know this song?" And she said, "Well, when I was a little girl, my father used to play it to me because he was, after all, the king."
Ah,
That old
Oh,
ma'am. She was quite funny, actually.
Yeah.
how fabulous.
I think one should have humor in life. And I grew up with parents, especially my father, who was always a very funny man, not in a sort of, not in a comedian's way. He was a raconteur. So at a dinner table, he would probably hold court because he had better stories than anyone else. So I grew up in a household that was very pro social intercourse, so that you could converse with people even from a very early age. I'd be taken to restaurants when I was 5.
So what's happened to men now? It just seems that they're all weird.
Well, are they really men? I don't know who's a man any longer. I get so many probably rather tasteless jokes on my WhatsApp, which is the only thing I know how to work, and I don't want to go any further than that. I don't know what's happened to men at all. What's happened to men ever? Sometimes I think women make far better choices because they're less aggressive.
What is next for you now?
Well, I'm going out to sort of do bits of promotion on the first Love album, but that doesn't actually get released till the end of May. The single Spent the Day in Bed, I'll do whatever promo needs to be done. And then I get back to doing what I usually do, which is I tour Europe about 3 times a year, especially going via Vienna, because in 1980, when I couldn't record for anyone else while this Main Man and Bowie madness the litigation was going on, I landed up in Vienna and had hits there, and I worked with another band over there. So I've got a sort of bit of a double life, but I love London. I'm a definite Londoner. So I always so happy to come back. And the best thing about it is I live 1 minute's walk from a swimming pool. And for 40 years, I swim every morning. Actually, I do aqua size, because if you can't keep yourself mentally and physically in shape at 75, you shouldn't go on a stage. And I love to swim. So I do what my mother would have called physical jerks in the morning with water up to here, and you're doing things like that. But I just think it's important, because if you don't look after yourself, nobody else is going to do it.
Absolutely. You have to love yourself.
Yes.
My mother used to say, if you don't watch your figure, nobody else will.
Well, my father always said, if you had to choose between sex and food, choose food, because at least you can do that 3 times a day.
very good.
But he
I love
also,
that.
my father also said, when you get past a certain age, don't watch your figure because you're going to look haggard in the face. Watch your face, because most people see you from the neck upwards when you get older.
Yes, but these days, darling, we can just do a little something about that.
Yeah, well, you might say that, but I personally don't believe in it. Okay, I do dye my hair with henna, and I tried to grow it out during COVID. I got to about that much of white, and I thought, ooh, that's not a good look. But I'm
Nah.
happy to be 75. I'm happy to have wrinkles. I would be outraged and shocked if somebody said, God, you look 40. That's bollocks. I want to look 75. I've lived a life, and I will continue living a life, and I don't want to be surgically helped, because I've got 2 new knees, a new hip, and I've just had a new shoulder put in.
So you're a
If I'm
bionic
going
woman.
under the knife, it's because of taking pain away, not because I want to look younger and attract some twat.
Debbie, you knew Bowie, didn't you?
Yeah, but I mean, because of the connection with Tony Hatch and my parents, and
Yeah.
and I was a little girl. He was very
How
uh
little, Debbie?
how little 11 when
Okay.
I
He was
first met
never,
David. I was
not a
11.
predatory type. I mean, he did love anything physically.
Yeah.
That's how he was. But I've always understood that, because sometimes an artist needs to exist in a certain way that should not be judged by other people. He's doing what he needs to do to get to where he is, to do what he wants to do.
He was just lovely to me. He used to take, because they represented all these people. He obviously used to pop into the office in Bickenhall Street, and he was always so nice. He used to take me up to the Wimpy Bar to buy me a milkshake.
And those were the days of the Wimpy Bar. I used to go to Wimpy Bars because that's all you had. And sometimes I'd sit and listen over the tannoy. I could hear the top 20 hits being played, but they weren't the real top 20. It was me, Elton John, when he was still Reg, and another singer called David Byron from Uriah Heep. And we used to do the top 20 hits in a studio. I used to get paid 25 quid a session. And if it was a lead vocal, you got 50 quid. Marvelous money in those days.
Yeah.
So we'd sit in a Wimpy Bar and I could hear the hits. But Bowie and I would sit in the Gioconda Cafe in Denmark Street, Tin Pan Alley, which now is being sadly ruined. The whole of Soho is being...
Isn't it ridiculous?
It's
I mean,
awful.
Denmark Street was so iconic, wasn't it?
Yeah, and I had management. Both of us wanted, he and I both wanted to be signed as songwriters. But in order to sell your songs, you had to be able to sing them. So you'd sit in the Gioconda and wait till somebody from one of the music publishers would come along and say, "Oi, we need a singer or a bass player or something." And then suddenly you had a session. So you'd nurse your cup of tea for as long as you could without being kicked out. But those were early 60s and everyone sat in that cafe. And I found my first managers that were 2 doors down, something called Southern Music, and they signed me up. They were great days because
we used to do that with voiceovers. I did a lot of voiceovers in the 80s, 90s, 2000s. And in the mid 80s, we literally used to sit down, oh God, I can't remember, Beak Street in a little sort of cafe. And we'd all just sit in there, and somebody had nobody had phones. We all had little bleepers. And literally, so, is somebody available to go to Silk Sound right now? Yeah, whoop, and off we go. It was the same sort of thing.
Is that speaking voiceovers, not singing?
Yes.
Oh,
yeah.
The voiceover business, I'd love to be in there. I don't know anyone who does it, but one ad selling, I don't know, Purcell or whatever. I mean, you're made up financially for ages.
Yeah, well, the first time I bought my phone, I remember buying this phone for £1,000, and it was probably 1991, and it was a huge amount of money to spend on a phone, but that's how much they cost in those days. And I remember it ringing just as I was going out of Soho, and they said, "Where are you?" And I said, "Well, I can be anywhere you like." And they said, "Right, go to," I think it was Mag Masters. Do you remember that studio? It's a voiceover studio. Go to Mag Masters now. And I went there and I did an advert for something, and it paid for that phone 5 times over.
Do you still do them though, voiceovers?
Yeah, not as much as I used to, but my daughter's now taken over the mantle.
You and I don't have a thick regional accent, which is actually.
But I'm from Sunderland. I'm from Sunderland originally, so the thing that I had to lose to start doing voiceovers is now I wouldn't have to lose that now, would I?
No.
No.
How times have changed.
Dana, honestly, we could talk to you for hours. We'd love you to come back and talk more.
Nice to speak to you all.
Lovely to hear your stories. Fantastic.
Well, if you like them, you can get it in my memoirs, which is called Weren't Born a Man, or I'm on something called Audible, which I read myself, and you get little bits of music between each chapter. And
wow, okay.
Plus more are in there.
Yeah, I've got Audible. I will definitely be listening.
Well, you'll be laughing. Don't read it on a train because you might get...
Bye.
Bye.